The rain hadn't stopped since Sunday morning. It was now Thursday, and the rhythmic drumming against the Victorian glass of the Miller home had shifted from soothing to suffocating. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and vinegar. "I thought I cleared these," Sarah muttered, pulling a plastic neon pink egg from behind the toaster. She had spent all morning scrubbing the kitchen, yet the remnants of the holiday seemed to be sprouting like weeds. Her husband, Mark, walked in from the living room, his face pale in the gray afternoon light. He held a wicker basket filled with green plastic grass. "Sarah, look at the dining table." He followed him. On the mahogany surface she had polished an hour ago sat 12 perfectly arranged hard-boiled eggs. They weren't the vibrant, marbled creations the kids had dyed. These were a sickly, bruised purple, the shells hairline fractured as if under immense internal pressure. "The kids?" she whispered. "Napping," Mark said, his voice trembling. "And I already took the trash to the curb last night. These shouldn't be here." A wet crack echoed through the silent room. One of the purple eggs on the table split open. It didn't reveal a yolk or a chocolate truffle. Instead, a thick, translucent fluid oozed onto the wood, smelling of stagnant pond water and old copper. Inside the shell lay a tiny, severed finger, too long to be human, tipped with a sharp, keratinous claw. The rain outside intensified, turning the sky a bruised charcoal. Sarah rushed to the window, intending to lock it, but froze. In the reflection of the glass, she saw the living room behind her. It wasn't the messy post-holiday house she knew. In the reflection, the room was draped in miles of pastel ribbons that looked like tattered flesh, and the Easter bunny lawn ornament from the yard was standing in the hallway. Except it wasn't an ornament. It was 7 feet tall, its fur matted with mud and yellowing foam, its glass eyes fixed on her. When she spun around, the hallway was empty. "Mark, we're leaving, now," she choked out. They ran for the front door, but as they grabbed the handle, the wood felt soft, almost organic. They pulled it open, only to find themselves stepping back into the kitchen. The pink egg was back behind the toaster. The bruised purple eggs were back on the table, uncracked. "It's a loop," Mark gasped, his breath hitching. "The clock! Look at the clock!" The grandfather clock in the hall was ticking backward. Every time the pendulum swung, the house seemed to reset into a more grotesque version of Easter Sunday. The smell of vinegar grew caustic, stinging their eyes. They heard a wet thumping sound from the stairs. Thump, drag, thump. Their 6-year-old son, Leo, stood at the landing. He wasn't crying. He was holding a basket, his small hands stained a permanent, deep crimson. "He says it's not over," Leo whispered, his eyes wide and vacant. "He says the hunt only ends when he finds all the good eggs." "Who, Leo?" Sarah moved toward him, but the floor beneath her feet felt like it was turning into soft, rotting peat. "The Warren King," the boy replied. From the shadows of the coat closet, a long, twitching ear emerged, followed by a face that was a ruin of twitching whiskers and jagged, oversized incisors. The creature didn't hop. It uncoiled, its limbs elongated and multi-jointed, unfolding like a rusted lawn chair. Sarah grabbed Mark's hand, bolted for the back door, and flung it open. They didn't find the backyard. They stepped back into the dining room. The 12 eggs on the table were all cracked now. 12 long, clawed fingers twitched in the slime. "Happy Easter," a voice croaked, not from the monster, but from the house itself. The rain turned into a rhythmic chant against the roof. The Millers realized then that the sun would never rise on Friday. The calendar on the wall flickered, the pages blurring as they tried to turn, only to snap back to Sunday, April 5th. They were the prizes in a hunt that had no end, trapped in a pastel-colored purgatory where the hunter was finally coming to collect his eggs. The rain had been falling for 72 hours, a relentless gray curtain that turned the world outside into a blurred watercolor of mud and drowned grass. Inside the Miller household, the air felt thick and humid, heavy with the scent of damp wood and the lingering, sugary ghost of chocolate. "He's under the basement stairs, Mommy," Toby said, his voice flat as he pushed a soggy piece of cereal around his bowl. "He says the hunt isn't over because he hasn't found the best prize yet." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. The post-Easter slump was hitting hard. "Toby, honey, we talked about this. The Easter bunny went back to his burrow on Sunday. He's probably sleeping now." "He doesn't sleep," Toby whispered, his eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. "He's still here." Sarah exchanged a weary look with her husband, David. They chalked it up to an overactive imagination fueled by too many jelly beans and the claustrophobia of being trapped indoors by the storm. But as the afternoon wore on, the house began to feel altered. It started with the footprints. David found them in the upstairs hallway, huge, muddy impressions that looked like human feet stretched to impossible lengths, topped with the distinct triangular claw marks of something leporine. They led from the attic pull-down ladder to the door of the guest room, then vanished. "The roof must be leaking," David muttered, though you couldn't explain the shape of the tracks. He mopped them up, but 10 minutes later, a wet slapping sound echoed from the ceiling joists. By dinner, the isolation felt like a physical weight. The rain pounded against the windows with such violence that the glass thrummed in its frames. The power flickered, casting long, jerky shadows across the walls. When the lights hummed back to life, the dining room had changed. The centerpiece, a ceramic basket Sarah had emptied on Monday, was full again, but it wasn't filled with plastic eggs. It was packed with raw, gray stones from the garden, each one meticulously wrapped in the crinkled, blood-stained foil of Easter candy. "David?" Sarah's voice was a thin wire. "Did you do this?" David didn't answer. He was staring at the pantry door. It was hanging off its hinges, and the interior was stripped bare. Not just the candy, but the flour, the sugar, and the meat from the fridge. Everything had been dragged into the dark crawl space beneath the floorboards. Thump, thump, thump. The sound came from directly behind them. It wasn't the light hop of a rabbit. It was the heavy, wet thud of something weighing hundreds of pounds. They turned slowly. At the end of the long, dark corridor leading to the bedrooms, a shape stood in the gloom. It was nearly 7 feet tall, its head brushing the ceiling. The silhouette was unmistakable, long, tattered ears that flopped unnaturally to one side, and a round, bloated body. "Is that a costume?" David stepped forward, his voice trembling. The thing stepped into the sliver of light spilling from the kitchen. It wasn't a costume. The fur was a matted, moldering carpet of grayish hair that seemed to twitch independently. The face was a nightmare of biological errors. The eyes were bulbous and milky, fixed on opposite sides of a twitching, wet snout. There was no friendly pink nose, only a vertical slit that exhaled a freezing mist smelling of wet earth and rot. It wore a vest, once perhaps pastel blue, now stained a dark, oily black. It held a wicker basket, but the weave wasn't wood.
It looked like interlaced bone. "Toby, get behind me," David hissed, reaching for a kitchen knife. The creature didn't move with a hop. It uncoiled. Its legs were multi-jointed, snapping with the sound of breaking dry wood as it lurched forward. It didn't speak, but a sound began to rise from its throat, a high-pitched rhythmic clicking that mimicked the sound of the rain on the roof. "The prize," the creature rasped. The voice wasn't human. It sounded like two stones grinding together. "I found the prize." It didn't look at the adults. Its milky eyes rolled in its sockets until they both converged on Toby. The boy stood mesmerized, his hand reaching out as if in a trance. "He has the golden egg, Mommy. He says it's inside me." Before David could lunge, the creature moved with impossible, blurred speed. It didn't use hands. Long, needle-like claws erupted from the ends of its furred limbs. It snatched Toby, pulling the boy into the mass of its rancid fur. "Toby!" Shara shrieked, sprinting toward the hallway. The creature backed into the shadows of the basement stairwell, the very place Toby had warned them about. As it descended, it began to shed. The oversized rabbit skin split down the back like a cicada's husk. What crawled out from inside the bunny was something pale, multi-limbed, and slick with a gelatinous afterbirth. It dragged the screaming child into the darkness of the foundation. David flung the basement door open, but there was no stairs, no floor, and no monster. There was only a gaping hole in the earth that smelled of a 1,000-year-old burrow. The rain stopped instantly. In the sudden, jarring silence, a single plastic Easter egg rolled out from the darkness of the hole. It was stained red, and as it hit David's foot, it popped open. Inside was Toby's tooth, still rooted in a piece of fresh pink gum. From deep beneath the house, the clicking sound began again, growing fainter as it moved further into the earth. The holiday was over, and the bunny had finally finished his harvest.
The rain was an unrelenting weight against the gables of the old Miller estate. It had been 3 days since Easter Sunday, but the house still felt cluttered with the ghost of the celebration. Tattered plastic grass clung to the floorboards like invasive weeds, and the cloying scent of cheap chocolate lingered in the humid, stagnant air. Elias sat in the dim light of the library, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the downpour acting as a metronome for his boredom. He had been meticulous in his cleanup, or so he thought, but as he reached behind the heavy velvet curtains to secure a latch against the wind, his fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. He pulled it out, a single, overlooked Easter egg. It was a deep, unnatural shade of violet, almost obsidian in the low light. Unlike the cheap plastic shells he had hidden for his nephews, this one felt heavy, its surface textured like polished bone rather than molded polymer. There was no seam where the two halves met. "Missed one," Elias murmured, his voice sounding thin against the backdrop of the storm. Curiosity, that old dangerous itch, took hold. He shook the egg. It didn't rattle with the sound of a jelly bean or a coin. Instead, there was a dull, wet thud, a weight shifting in a thick liquid. He brought the egg to the desk lamp. As the light hit the violet surface, he realized the color wasn't dyed, it was pulsating. Faint, rhythmic tremors vibrated against his palm, like a frantic heartbeat. Elias fetched a letter opener, the silver blade glinting. He pressed the tip against the center of the egg. The shell didn't crack, it yielded. It felt like piercing a piece of fruit that had gone soft with rot.
A thick, viscous amber fluid began to seep out, smelling of scorched sugar and copper. As the shell split, something moved. It wasn't a toy. It was a coil of pale, translucent tissue, a knot of veins and wet, twitching membranes. At the center of the mass was a single, lidless eye, the iris of vibrant, sickly gold. It stared at Elias, the pupil contracting in the lamplight. Elias recoiled, dropping the egg. It didn't shatter on the hardwood floor. It landed with a soft, organic squelch and began to uncurl. The storm outside intensified, a crack of thunder shaking the foundations of the house. The power flickered, plunged the room into darkness for a heartbeat, and then stabilized. In that second of blackness, the thing from the egg had vanished. "Just an animal," Elias whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Some strange parasite, a prank." But he knew no prankster could manufacture that gold-eyed gaze. As he searched the floor with a flashlight, he noticed the rain sounds had changed. The tapping on the windows was no longer the random splatter of water. It was rhythmic, echoing the heartbeat he had felt in the egg. Thump, 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 thump. He walked into the hallway, the beam of his light cutting through the gloom. The house felt stretched, the corridors longer than they should be. On the wallpaper, the floral patterns seemed to be bruising, the purple dye from the egg spreading in arterial sprays across the Victorian roses. He reached the kitchen and froze. Every Easter basket he had neatly stacked on the counter was now overflowing, not with candy, but with them. The violet shells were everywhere, tucked into the fruit bowl, nestled in the sink, perched atop the refrigerator. Hundreds of them, and they were all open. The amber fluid was dripping from the counter, pooling on the linoleum like honey. A wet, sliding sound came from the ceiling. Elias tilted his flashlight upward. The plaster was heaving. Dozens of the pale, vein-filled creatures were clinging to the crown molding, their golden eyes reflecting his light like a sea of coins. They weren't growing, they were merging, their translucent bodies knitting together into a singular, pulsing mass that carpeted the ceiling. The smell of scorched sugar was now a suffocating stench. Elias scrambled for the front door, his shoes slipping in the amber sludge that was now inches deep. He grabbed the handle and twisted, but it wouldn't budge. The wood had become soft, the brass fixture sinking into it like it was being swallowed by flesh. He turned back to the room, the flashlight's batteries beginning to fail. In the dying amber glow, he saw the last egg back on the library desk. But it wasn't an egg anymore. It had grown to the size of a human torso, its violet walls translucent. Inside the shell, a shape was forming. It had limbs, too many limbs, and a face that was a mockery of his own, pressed against the inner membrane. The realization hit him with the force of the gale outside. The Easter tradition of hiding wasn't a game for the children. It was a biological necessity for the thing in the house. It needed to be found. It needed the warmth of a hand, the heat of a house, and the curiosity of a witness to trigger the final stage of its life cycle. The ceiling mass began to drop, raining down like heavy, wet silk. As the light finally died, Elias heard the shell on the desk tear open. The hunt was over. The prize was finally being claimed.
The rain was a rhythmic, suffocating shroud that had draped itself over the Miller estate since Good Friday. It didn't fall in drops, it fell in sheets, blurring the world beyond the salt-stained windows into a gray, watery purgatory. Inside, the house was a tomb of silent grief. Elias sat in the parlor, the floral wallpaper peeling like dead skin in the corners. On the mantel sat a single, hand-painted Easter egg, deep cerulean with a gold band, that his younger brother, Leo, had finished just hours before the accident. Leo had been gone for 2 weeks, buried in the cold, unyielding earth of the valley cemetery. Easter Sunday had passed in a hollow haze of black coffee and unanswered phone calls. Now it was Wednesday, 3 days after the resurrection was supposed to have been celebrated. The house felt heavy, as if the water soaking into the foundation was pulling the rooms deeper into the soil. Elias stared at the cerulean egg. He could still smell the vinegar from the dye, a sharp, acidic scent that cut through the musty odor of the old house. Thump. Elias froze. The sound had come from the second floor. It wasn't the settling of wood or the wind rattling a shutter. It was the distinct, heavy drag of a footstep. "Dad?" Elias called out, his voice cracking. His father was sedated in the guest room, drowned in a sea of grief and prescription sleep. There was no answer, only the relentless drum, drum, drum of the rain against the glass. Thump. Drag. Thump. The sound moved across the hallway above him. It was slow, deliberate, and horribly familiar. Leo had walked with a slight limp since a childhood biking accident, a rhythmic hitch in his step that Elias could recognize in his sleep. A cold sweat broke across Elias's neck. He stood, his knees shaking, and gripped the banister of the grand staircase. The air in the foyer felt suddenly frigid, smelling of wet earth and something cloyingly sweet, like lilies left to rot in a vase. "Leo?" he whispered, the name a prayer and a curse. He climbed the stairs, the wood groaning under his weight. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows. At the far end, the door to Leo's bedroom stood slightly ajar. A sliver of pale, flickering light escaped from the gap, though Elias knew he had turned off every lamp in the house. As he approached, the sound of the rain seemed to intensify, sounding less like water and more like thousands of tiny fingernails scratching at the siding. He pushed the door open. The room was exactly as Leo had left it. The unmade bed, the scattered sketches of birds, the half-empty glass of water on the nightstand. But in the center of the rug stood a figure. It was draped in the yellow raincoat Leo had worn on the day of the storm, the plastic slick and shimmering with moisture. "Leo? Is it really you?" Elias took a step forward, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The figure didn't turn. Its shoulders were hunched, its head bowed. "I came back, Elias," a voice rasped. It sounded like Leo's, but the resonance was off, as if the words were being filtered through a throat filled with silt. "The stone was so heavy, Elias. I had to dig." Elias felt a wave of nauseating joy, clashing with a primal, screaming terror. "We buried you, Leo. We saw the casket." "Easter is for the rising, but the earth doesn't like to let go. It changes things. It adds pieces." The figure turned fully into the light. The yellow hood fell back. It wasn't Leo. Or rather, it was Leo's skin stretched over something that didn't fit. The face was a landscape of gray, waterlogged flesh, held together by thick black stitches of some fibrous root. Where his eyes should have been, there were only 2 smooth white stones, pulsing with a faint bioluminescent glow. The jaw hung unnaturally low, and as it moved, Elias saw that the mouth wasn't filled with teeth, but hundreds of tiny, writhing, pale grubs that mimicked the shape of a smile. "I brought you a gift," the creature rasped, reaching into the pocket of the yellow coat. It pulled out an egg. It was the cerulean one from the mantel, but it was dripping with a black, oily discharge. The gold band had been replaced by a ring of human hair. "Open it," the creature hissed, the grubs in its mouth spilling over its bottom lip. Elias backed away, but the door behind him slammed shut with a force that shook the frames on the walls. The house groaned, the floorboards beneath him turning soft and spongy like peat moss. The smell of the grave was overwhelming now, a suffocating mix of decomposition and wet clay. The creature lurched forward, its movements jerky and multi-jointed, like an insect trying to walk in a human suit. It pressed the black dripping egg into Elias's hand. The shell was warm, feverishly hot. "Everything rises, Elias," the thing whispered, its stone eyes inches from his own. "But nothing comes back the same. We're all part of the garden now." The egg in Elias's hand began to crack. It didn't reveal a yolk or a toy. From the fracture, a pale, needle-thin finger emerged, followed by another, and then a gold-flecked eye that matched the creature's own. The rain outside suddenly ceased, leaving a silence more terrifying than the storm. In the quiet, Elias heard the sound of hundreds of eggs cracking simultaneously throughout the house, under the floorboards, inside the walls, and beneath his father's bed. The resurrection wasn't a miracle, it was an infestation, and the Miller house was the first nest.